At 18, Ethan Carter had just been told he was too old to stay in foster care. Everything he owned fit into one worn backpack. His 16-year-old brother, Noah, was waiting for him outside with an old pickup truck that barely started and exactly $100 hidden inside the glove compartment. That money was supposed to buy food, maybe a few nights in a motel if they were lucky. Instead, Ethan spent every last dollar on a ruined mechanic's workshop everyone else wanted demolished. People laughed. The auctioneer actually asked if he was sure. One man muttered that the place wasn't worth the cost of hauling away the scrap metal. Even Noah wondered if his brother had finally lost hope. For the first 2 weeks, it looked like they were right. The roof leaked whenever it rained. The walls leaned so badly they had to prop them up with old beams. Rats had claimed one corner, and weeds had claimed everything else. Then, on the 17th day, Noah dropped a rusted hammer onto the cracked concrete floor. Instead of the dull thud they expected, the sound echoed, like there was empty space beneath the workshop. 3 days later, after breaking through nearly 8 inches of concrete, the brothers uncovered a thick steel hatch that had been hidden for decades. It had no handle, no keyhole, only one sentence stamped into the rusted metal. Not everything of value belongs in a bank. What they discovered beneath that hatch would change not only their lives, but the history of an entire town. But to understand why 2 homeless brothers ended up standing over a forgotten vault, we have to go back to the morning everything they knew came to an end. The rain had already started before Ethan Carter stepped out of the foster home for the last time. The old brick building looked exactly as it always had, but everything felt different now. At 18, he had officially aged out of the system. No ceremony, no celebration, just a signature on a few forms, a worn backpack over one shoulder, and a dented metal toolbox that had belonged to his father. Those tools were the only thing he had managed to keep through every foster placement since he was 9 years old. Mrs. Daniels walked him to the front door. "I wish things were different," she said softly. Ethan nodded without replying. They both knew there were younger children waiting for the empty bed he was leaving behind. Outside, an aging blue pickup truck idled in the parking lot. Noah climbed out the moment he saw his brother. At 16, he looked thinner than he should have, but he still managed a crooked grin. "Happy birthday," he said, trying to sound cheerful. Ethan smiled back. "Let's get moving." The truck had been given to them by Mr. Alvarez, a retired mechanic who volunteered at the foster home. Before handing Ethan the keys, the old man had tucked an envelope into the glove compartment. Noah opened it once they were on the road. Inside were 5 $20 bills, exactly $100. "That's everything," Noah said quietly. Ethan glanced at the envelope before returning his eyes to the road. "We'll make it last." Neither of them truly believed it. They spent the afternoon driving through neighboring towns looking for work. Every repair shop gave the same answer. They were too young, too inexperienced, or simply unlucky. By late afternoon, the fuel gauge was dropping almost as quickly as Ethan's confidence. "Where are we sleeping tonight?" Noah finally asked. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'll figure something out." Noah nodded because he trusted his brother. But Ethan wondered how much longer that trust could survive reality. Near sunset, they passed a small county auction. Rusted farm equipment, broken furniture, and abandoned machinery filled the lot. Ethan only slowed because a handwritten sign advertised free coffee, while Noah disappeared toward the refreshment table. Ethan wandered between the unsold items. At the far end of the property stood a collapsed mechanic's workshop. Half the roof had caved in. Windows were shattered. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. A faded sign still hung above the entrance, though most of the lettering had disappeared. It looked beyond saving. "Final item," the auctioneer announced. "Old workshop. Minimum bid $100. Silence followed. Nobody raised a hand. Someone laughed and muttered that demolition would cost more than the building itself. Ethan stared at the structure. The walls were damaged, but the steel frame still stood. More importantly, it had something they didn't have: a roof, a place that could become theirs. Noah returned carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "What are you looking at?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward and raised his hand. $100. Several people turned toward him. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "Son, are you sure?" Ethan reached into the envelope, counted out every bill they owned, and nodded. "I'm sure." Minutes later, the keys to the ruined workshop rested in his palm. As the crowd drove away shaking their heads, the brothers stood alone in front of their new property. Noah forced a laugh. "Well, I guess we have a home." Ethan pushed open the warped front door. Dust drifted through the fading light. The floor was littered with broken tools and collapsed beams. Noah picked up a rusted hammer, turned it over in his hand, then accidentally let it slip. It struck the cracked concrete with a sharp metallic clang instead of a dull thud. The sound echoed beneath their feet. The brothers looked at each other without speaking. The echo lingered for a moment before fading into silence. Ethan and Noah stood perfectly still, listening for it again. Noah picked up the rusted hammer and dropped it onto the cracked concrete one more time. The metallic ring bounced beneath their feet, hollow and unmistakable. Ethan slowly looked around the workshop. "That doesn't sound right." Noah knelt and brushed away years of dirt with his sleeve. The floor was covered in cracks, oil stains, and scattered debris, but nothing immediately explained the strange echo. "Maybe there's an old drain underneath," Noah suggested. Ethan wasn't convinced. "Maybe. Either way, this place isn't safe until we clean it up." They spent the next morning hauling broken boards, twisted sheet metal, and piles of rusted parts outside. Every trip revealed another reminder of how badly the building had been neglected. The roof leaked through several holes, forcing them to place buckets wherever rainwater dripped inside. One wall leaned enough that Ethan reinforced it with heavy timber salvaged from a collapsed storage shed behind the workshop. By midday, both brothers were exhausted. Their clothes were streaked with dust, and their hands already showed fresh cuts. "I thought owning a place would feel different," Noah admitted while catching his breath. Ethan looked around the empty building. "It still can." A pickup slowed as it passed the property. The driver laughed through his open window. "You boys really paid money for that dump." Another man riding beside him shook his head. "Would have been cheaper to sleep under a bridge." The truck disappeared, leaving only the sound of fading laughter. Noah forced a smile, but Ethan noticed the disappointment in his eyes. "Ignore them," Ethan said. "One day this place will stand again." They returned to work without another word. Late that afternoon, an older woman carrying 2 grocery bags walked through the broken front entrance. Her silver hair was tied neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "You boys must be the new owners," she said with a warm smile. Ethan quickly wiped the dust from his hands. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Helen Brooks. I live across the road." She held out one of the bags. Inside were sandwiches, canned soup, bread, and a small jar of homemade jam. Noah's eyes widened. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Helen replied, "but everyone deserves a decent meal." The brothers thanked her repeatedly before sitting together on an overturned workbench to eat. For the first time since leaving foster care, the workshop felt a little less empty. Before leaving, Helen paused near the doorway. "This old place meant something to a lot of people once," she said. "I'd hate to see it disappear completely." Ethan looked toward the damaged walls. "We're going to try our best." Helen smiled and walked home. The following morning, Ethan visited the local hardware store, hoping to buy inexpensive nails and pry bars. The owner directed him to a nearby scrapyard where old tools could sometimes be found. The yard belonged to Frank Dalton, a broad-shouldered man with grease permanently stained into his hands. Frank listened quietly as Ethan explained he had purchased the abandoned workshop. "So you're the brothers everyone keeps talking about," Frank said. Ethan nodded. Frank glanced toward the road leading back to the property before speaking again. "Strange place." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. Frank shrugged. "People say the old owner left years ago." He hesitated. "I've never believed he truly left." Ethan waited for more, but Frank simply pointed him toward a pile of used tools. The conversation ended there. Back at the workshop, Noah continued sweeping loose rubble away from the cracked floor. As he pushed aside a layer of broken concrete near the center of the building, something caught his attention. A narrow strip of dark metal appeared beneath the dust. He knelt and scraped away more debris with a screwdriver. It wasn't random scrap. It was a flat steel plate running straight beneath the concrete. Along one edge, the surrounding cement looked smoother than the rest of the floor, as though someone had carefully patched it long ago. "Ethan," Noah called quietly. Ethan crossed the room and crouched beside him. Together they cleared away another few inches of dirt. The outline became clearer. Someone hadn't simply built over this section of floor. Someone had deliberately hidden it. The outline beneath the concrete became clearer with every swing of the hammer. Ethan worked slowly, careful not to damage the metal hidden below, while Noah cleared away loose rubble with an old shovel. After nearly an hour, the patch of concrete surrounding the steel was gone. What remained was not a random sheet of metal, but a heavy rectangular door set deep into the workshop floor. Thick hinges disappeared into the concrete frame, and a circular locking mechanism sat at its center. There was no handle, no visible keyhole, only rust and years of silence. Noah crouched beside it. Who builds something like this under a repair shop? Ethan brushed dirt away with a wire brush from his father's toolbox. Someone who wanted whatever was down there to stay hidden. As more rust came away, a small emblem slowly appeared on the center of the lock. It showed an anvil crossed with a wrench beneath the outline of a rising sun. The design seemed strangely familiar. Ethan stood and looked toward the workshop entrance. Above the broken doorway, the faded wooden sign still hung where it had likely remained for decades. Most of the lettering had disappeared, but he climbed onto a crate and wiped away years of grime with a rag. Beneath the dust, the same emblem appeared, barely visible but unmistakable. He climbed back down. It's the workshop's original logo. Noah looked from the sign to the steel door. So whoever built this wanted it connected to the shop. Ethan nodded. Which means this wasn't an accident. They searched the lock for a release, pressing against every edge and turning the circular plate with all the strength they had. Nothing moved. Ethan tried slipping a pry bar beneath one corner of the door, but the steel didn't lift even a fraction of an inch. They searched the surrounding floor for hidden catches or bolts. but found nothing. By midday, both brothers were sweating despite the cool air inside the building. Noah sat back against the wall. Maybe it's welded shut. Ethan shook his head. No. If someone wanted to seal it forever, they would have poured solid concrete over everything. This was built to open. Then we're missing something. Ethan couldn't argue with that. They covered the exposed door with a tarp before walking into town to buy penetrating oil and stronger tools. Money was already running low, so Ethan carefully counted every dollar before choosing only what they absolutely needed. On the way back, they stopped at Frank Dalton's scrapyard, hoping he might have an old wrench large enough to fit the locking mechanism. Frank looked up from an engine block as they approached. Back again. Ethan placed the sketch he had made of the emblem on the counter. Have you ever seen this symbol? Frank's expression changed almost instantly. His eyes lingered on the drawing longer than necessary before he quietly set it back on the counter. Where did you find that? Ethan hesitated. Inside the workshop. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he wiped his hands on a rag and stared toward the open yard. I haven't seen that mark in a long time. Do you know what it means? Noah asked. Frank avoided the question. Some things were left alone for good reasons. Ethan stepped closer. If you know something, please tell us. Frank let out a slow breath. The man who owned that workshop kept to himself. Folks said he was stubborn, said he worked day and night. He paused before continuing. After he disappeared, people stopped asking questions. Disappeared, Ethan repeated. Frank immediately shook his head as though he had already said too much. Listen to me, boys. His voice became unusually firm. Whatever's under that floor, leave it where it is. Ethan searched the older man's face for an explanation, but Frank simply turned back toward the engine on his workbench. The conversation was over. The brothers left the scrapyard in silence, carrying the wrench they had come to buy, but no answers. As the workshop came back into view at the end of the road, Ethan glanced at Noah. Neither of them spoke, yet both were thinking the same thing. If opening the hidden door frightened a man like Frank Dalton, then whatever lay beneath it had been waiting a very long time to be found. The photograph stayed on Ethan's workbench long after sunset. He studied the faded face of the man standing proudly in front of the workshop. Samuel Turner looked nothing like the kind of person who would abandon everything without a word. His clothes were simple, his smile modest, and behind him stood the same building that now belonged to two brothers with little more than hope and one battered toolbox. Early the next morning, Helen Brooks crossed the road carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. I thought you boys could use a proper breakfast, she said. Noah smiled as she uncovered warm biscuits and homemade jam. You keep saving us, he said. Helen laughed softly. Someone once did the same for this town. Ethan reached for the photograph. You knew him well, didn't you? Helen adjusted her glasses and held the picture carefully. Everyone knew Samuel Turner. If your tractor stopped during harvest, he came. If your water pump failed in winter, he came. If you couldn't afford to pay, he fixed it anyway. Noah looked surprised. How did he keep the shop open? Helen shook her head. I never understood that. He wasn't interested in making money. He believed people should help each other while they still could. Ethan glanced toward the hidden steel door beneath the floorboards. Then why does nobody talk about him anymore? Helen's smile slowly disappeared. That's the question I've asked myself for years. She looked around the workshop, her eyes lingering on the cracked walls. This place used to be full of people. Farmers waited outside drinking coffee. Children played while their parents talked. You could hear hammers from sunrise until dark. She paused before continuing. Then one week, the doors were locked. Did anyone see him leave? Ethan asked. Helen slowly shook her head. People said he moved away. Others said he retired. Eventually, everyone stopped asking. Ethan frowned. That doesn't make sense. It never did, Helen admitted quietly. After she returned home, the brothers searched the rear storage room again. Broken shelves covered the floor, and water had ruined most of the papers left behind. Ethan carefully lifted collapsed boards while Noah checked every drawer that hadn't completely rotted away. Nearly everything they found fell apart at the slightest touch. Just as they were about to give up, Noah noticed a narrow wooden cabinet trapped beneath an old workbench. Together, they pulled it free. The first drawer held only rusted bolts. The second contained cracked measuring tools. The bottom drawer stuck halfway open until Ethan pried it loose with a screwdriver. Hidden beneath several oil-stained cloths lay a sealed envelope. Inside was a single black and white photograph that had survived surprisingly well. Samuel Turner stood beside several men in front of the workshop. The building looked almost new, and hanging above the entrance was the same wooden sign that still remained outside today, although the lettering had faded with age. One detail stood out clearly. The emblem above the doorway matched the symbol carved into the hidden steel door beneath the workshop floor. An anvil crossed with a wrench beneath a rising sun. Noah stared at the photograph before looking toward the center of the workshop. It wasn't just a logo, he said quietly. Ethan nodded as he carefully slipped the picture back into its envelope. Whatever is behind that steel door belonged to Samuel Turner. He looked once more at the smiling faces in the old photograph. The story everyone remembered was that Samuel had simply walked away from his workshop. But standing there with the photograph in his hands, Ethan no longer believed that story at all. For the next 2 days, the steel door refused to give up its secret. Ethan and Noah tried everything they could think of without damaging it. They cleaned away every trace of rust around the locking mechanism, soaked the metal with penetrating oil, and searched every inch of the workshop for a missing key or hidden release. Nothing worked. The circular lock would not turn, and the thick door remained firmly sealed beneath the floor. Whoever built this expected it to last forever, Noah said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Ethan shook his head. No, they expected someone to open it someday. We just don't know how. That evening, Ethan sat beside his father's old toolbox, turning one of the worn wrenches over in his hands. The lock on the hidden door reminded him of machinery rather than an ordinary vault. It wasn't designed to be forced. It was designed to be understood. Early the next morning, he examined the circular mechanism again. The raised emblem at its center had shallow grooves surrounding it, almost like the face of a giant bolt. He measured the distance between the grooves, then compared it with several oversized wrenches they had salvaged from the workshop. None fit perfectly, but one came close. "Help me hold it steady," Ethan said. Noah braced the wrench while Ethan slipped a length of pipe over the handle for extra leverage. Slowly, they pushed together. At first, nothing happened. Then a deep, metallic click echoed beneath the concrete. Both brothers froze. They pushed again. The rusted mechanism groaned after decades without movement. Dust drifted from the edges of the steel frame. "It's turning," Noah whispered. Another careful push. A second heavy click echoed through the workshop. The pressure on the wrench suddenly eased. Ethan pulled it free and gripped the edge of the thick steel door with both hands. "Ready?" Noah nodded. Together they lifted. The hinges protested with a long, scraping groan as the heavy door slowly rose. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. Ethan found an old flashlight in the toolbox and shined it into the opening. A narrow concrete staircase disappeared beneath the workshop. The walls below looked dry despite the years. "We're really doing this," Noah said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Stay behind me." They descended one cautious step at a time. At the bottom waited a small underground room surrounded by concrete walls. There were no piles of gold coins or stacks of cash waiting for them. Instead, wooden shelves lined both sides of the room. Dozens of weathered boxes sat neatly arranged exactly where someone had left them many years earlier. A wooden work table stood in the center. Resting on it was an old pocket watch beneath a layer of dust. Ethan picked it up carefully. The hands had stopped at exactly 4:17. He gently wound the crown, but the mechanism refused to move. Someone had placed it there intentionally. Noah opened the nearest wooden crate. Inside were bundles of papers wrapped in cloth instead of valuables. Another crate held carefully labeled folders. A third contained ledgers stacked in perfect order. "This isn't a treasure vault," Noah said. Ethan slowly nodded. "No." He looked around the silent room. Someone wanted these records protected. On the far corner of the work table lay a single leather-bound journal. Unlike the other documents, it rested by itself as though it had been left there for the first person who finally reached the room. Ethan brushed away the dust and carefully opened the cover. Ethan carefully opened the leather-bound journal, afraid the brittle pages might fall apart in his hands. Instead, the worn binding held together surprisingly well. The first page contained only a name written in neat handwriting: Samuel Turner. Beneath it was a simple sentence: "If these pages are ever read, then someone finally cared enough to ask what really happened." Ethan and Noah exchanged a silent look before Ethan turned the page. The entries were dated over many years. At first, they described ordinary days inside the workshop. Samuel recorded repair jobs, weather conditions, and the names of local farmers who visited. But as the pages continued, a different story slowly emerged. Samuel wasn't simply repairing broken machinery. He had been quietly designing stronger replacement parts that lasted longer and cost far less than the factory versions. Instead of patenting the improvements for profit, he built them himself and charged only enough to cover materials. One entry described rebuilding a farmer's harvest equipment after a fire had destroyed almost everything the family owned. Another told of repairing water pumps for several neighboring farms without accepting payment because drought had ruined the year's crops. "He wasn't running a business," Noah said quietly. "He was keeping people alive." Ethan nodded without looking up from the journal. The further he read, the heavier each page seemed to become. Months later, Samuel's writing changed. The cheerful notes disappeared. In their place were shorter entries filled with disappointment. He described repeated visits from a wealthy businessman who wanted to purchase every design and blueprint stored inside the workshop. Samuel never wrote the man's name in anger. Instead, he simply recorded the same answer each time: "I will not sell what belongs to the people who depend on it." Another entry mentioned that several offers had become increasingly generous. Samuel still refused every one. "He could have made a fortune," Noah whispered. Ethan slowly turned another page. That wasn't what mattered to him. The final entries became noticeably shorter. Samuel wrote that certain records needed to be protected. He worried that the work completed inside the shop might someday disappear if it remained above ground. Then came the final dated page. If honesty becomes inconvenient for powerful people, truth often needs a safe place to wait. The remaining pages were blank. Silence filled the underground room. Noah looked around at the neatly stacked boxes lining the walls. That's why all of this was hidden. Ethan nodded. Not because it was valuable in money, because it was evidence. He carefully closed the journal and reached for one of the cloth-wrapped bundles lying beside it. Inside were engineering sketches, handwritten measurements, and neatly organized workshop records. Everything had been labeled with remarkable care. Beneath another stack rested a single sealed envelope, thicker than the others and protected by wax that had darkened with age. Across the front, written in Samuel Turner's unmistakable handwriting, were only 8 words. Open only if the truth has been buried. Ethan held the envelope without breaking the seal. Ethan held the sealed envelope for several moments before carefully breaking the brittle wax. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. It was not a personal letter. It was a collection of signed statements, receipts, engineering records, and legal documents, each neatly organized beneath a short cover page written by Samuel Turner. The first sentence immediately caught Ethan's attention. These records exist so the truth can survive longer than memory. Noah leaned closer as Ethan spread the papers across the work table. There were copies of workshop invoices, handwritten agreements with local farmers, and detailed drawings for replacement machine parts that matched the descriptions in Samuel's journal. Several pages carried signatures from people who had witnessed his work. Others confirmed that he had refused repeated offers to sell his designs. He kept proof of everything, Noah said quietly. Ethan nodded. He knew someone might question his story one day. Near the bottom of the stack lay another document bearing several signatures from respected members of the town decades earlier. It described how Samuel had donated improved equipment to struggling farms during difficult harvest seasons, instead of charging for the repairs. Every statement supported what they had already read in the journal. None of it looked like the work of someone trying to become wealthy. It looked like the work of someone protecting his neighbors. Ethan carefully returned the papers to the envelope before carrying everything upstairs into the workshop office where the light was better. They spent the afternoon sorting the records into neat piles. The more they organized, the clearer the picture became. Samuel had documented nearly every important decision he made. Nothing appeared exaggerated. Everything could be traced through receipts, signatures, and sketches. People forgot him, Noah said, but he made sure the facts wouldn't disappear. Ethan looked around the quiet workshop. Maybe he expected someone to find this someday. That evening, Ethan decided there was one person who deserved to know what they had discovered. The next morning, they drove to Frank Dalton's scrapyard carrying only a small portion of the documents and one of Samuel's signed engineering sketches. Frank looked up from his workbench as they approached. His expression tightened the moment he saw the familiar handwriting. "You opened it," he said softly. Ethan didn't deny it. Instead, he placed the sketch on the bench. "These aren't rumors. They're records." Frank stared at the paper for a long time before removing his glasses. "My father worked in that workshop," he finally admitted. Noah looked surprised. "He knew Samuel Turner?" Frank nodded slowly. "For years." His voice carried a quiet weight that hadn't been there before. "He always said Samuel was the finest mechanic he'd ever met." "Then why did everyone forget him?" Ethan asked. Frank lowered his eyes. "After the workshop closed, people stopped talking. My father told me there were things he wished he had spoken up about." He paused. "But he never did." "Why not?" Noah asked gently. Frank took a slow breath. He believed the truth would only bring more trouble. He regretted staying silent for the rest of his life. None of them spoke for several seconds. Frank finally looked back at Ethan. "If those records are real, don't lose them." Ethan carefully folded the documents and placed them back inside the envelope. As the brothers prepared to leave, a white pickup stopped outside the scrapyard. A man stepped out carrying an official folder. He glanced toward the workshop visible down the road before approaching Frank. "I'm looking for the new owners of the old Turner property." Ethan stepped forward. "That's us." The man handed him a formal notice. "The town has approved a redevelopment inspection. Unless major safety concerns are addressed immediately, the building is scheduled for demolition." Ethan looked down at the paper while Noah silently stared toward the workshop that had finally begun to feel like home. Ethan read the demolition notice twice before folding it back into its envelope. The date printed near the bottom gave them only a few days before the inspection that would determine whether the workshop would be torn down. Noah looked toward the old building across the road. "If they tear it down, everything underground could disappear." Ethan nodded. "Then we don't have much time." Back inside the workshop, the brothers spread Samuel Turner's journal, the signed statements, engineering drawings, and receipts across the old workbench. The evidence was convincing, but Ethan knew documents alone would not save the building. They needed people who remembered the man behind the papers. Their first stop was Helen Brooks. She quietly read several pages before wiping away a tear. "This is exactly who Samuel was," she said. "I only wish more people were still here to tell you themselves." She disappeared into her house and returned carrying a worn cardboard box. Inside were dozens of old letters tied together with faded ribbon. "These were written to Samuel over the years," she explained. "He never threw them away. After the workshop closed, someone asked me to keep them safe." Ethan carefully unfolded the first letter. A farmer thanked Samuel for repairing equipment after a storm had destroyed nearly everything the family owned. Another came from a widow whose water pump had been restored without charge during the coldest winter she could remember. Each letter described kindness rather than business. None mentioned money. "People didn't just respect him," Noah said quietly. "They depended on him." Helen nodded. "Many families are still here. They may not remember every detail, but they'll remember what he did for their parents and grandparents." Encouraged, the brothers spent the next 2 days visiting homes throughout the town. Some people politely listened before returning to their work. Others admitted they had heard Samuel's name only in passing. A few simply shrugged, believing the past was too distant to matter anymore. Each unanswered conversation left Noah more discouraged. "Maybe Frank was right," he said as they walked back toward the workshop one evening. "Maybe everyone already forgot." Ethan looked at the stack of letters in his hands. "These people didn't forget. They just haven't been reminded." The following morning, Helen introduced the brothers to an elderly couple whose father had once farmed nearby. After reading one of Samuel's receipts, the husband slowly smiled. "I remember that emblem," he said. "It was painted on every crate that left the workshop." His wife disappeared into another room before returning with a faded family photograph. In the background stood a repaired tractor bearing one of Samuel's replacement parts. "My father always said that machine kept us on the farm," she told them. By the end of the day, similar stories began appearing one after another. An aging mechanic remembered learning his trade by watching Samuel work. Another family found an old receipt tucked inside a Bible. Someone else produced a faded newspaper clipping showing the workshop during a harvest festival decades earlier. None of the discoveries alone proved everything recorded in Samuel's journal, but together they painted the same picture. The workshop had once been an important part of the community. Ethan carefully organized every letter, photograph, receipt, and witness statement into separate folders. The growing collection no longer felt like forgotten history. It felt like a case waiting to be heard. As the sun set, Noah looked toward the town hall, where the inspection would soon determine the workshop's future. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Ethan closed the final folder and looked at the building that had given two homeless brothers their first real home. "We'll find out when the town makes its decision." The meeting hall filled long before the scheduled inspection began. Farmers, mechanics, retirees, and longtime residents quietly took their seats, while Ethan and Noah carried several neatly organized boxes to the front of the room. Inside were Samuel Turner's journal, engineering drawings, signed statements, old receipts, photographs, and the letters Helen Brooks had preserved for decades. Ethan glanced at his younger brother. Noah gave him a small nod. They had come this far together. They would finish it together. The town officials called the meeting to order. At the front sat Mayor Collins, who opened the folder containing the redevelopment proposal. "The purpose of today's meeting," he announced, "is to determine whether the former Turner workshop should be demolished under the current safety plan or whether there is sufficient reason to delay that decision." Ethan stood before anyone else could speak. "I'd like to present new evidence before that decision is made." The mayor nodded. "Go ahead." Ethan placed Samuel's journal on the table first. He explained how the hidden room beneath the workshop had been discovered and how every document had been preserved in carefully labeled boxes. He did not exaggerate. He simply allowed the records to speak for themselves. One by one, he presented engineering sketches, repair logs, signed agreements, and receipts showing how Samuel had repaired machinery for struggling families while asking little or nothing in return. Noah arranged the photographs beside them, each showing the workshop during better years with the familiar emblem displayed above the entrance. Helen Brooks then stepped forward, holding one of the preserved letters. She described the man she had known as a young woman. "Samuel never cared about being remembered," she said. "He cared about helping people get through another season." Her voice trembled slightly as she finished. "But that doesn't mean he deserves to be forgotten." Several residents quietly nodded. The elderly couple the brothers had visited spoke next. They shared the faded photograph of their family's repair tractor and explained how Samuel's work had saved their father's farm after a difficult harvest. Another resident produced an old receipt bearing Samuel's signature. Frank Dalton slowly walked to the front of the room last. The hall became silent. He looked at the papers spread across the table before speaking. "My father worked beside Samuel Turner." He paused, choosing each word carefully. "He told me many times that Samuel was the finest mechanic he'd ever known. After the workshop closed, my father believed he should have defended the truth while people still listened. He carried that regret for the rest of his life." Frank looked toward Ethan. "I'm not making the same mistake." The room remained quiet for several moments. Mayor Collins carefully examined the journal, the signed statements, and the supporting documents. He turned several pages before finally closing the cover. "These records appear authentic," he said. "More importantly, they are supported by independent testimony from multiple longtime residents." He looked toward the audience. "This workshop clearly holds historical significance beyond the building itself." The redevelopment proposal was quietly set aside. "The demolition order is withdrawn pending preservation review." Relief spread across the room. Noah released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ethan simply closed his eyes for a moment before thanking everyone who had come forward. As people slowly left the hall, several stopped to shake the brothers' hands. Others paused to study Samuel's photographs one last time. For the first time in decades, his name was spoken with respect instead of silence. Late that afternoon, Ethan returned alone to the workshop. The old wooden sign still hung above the entrance, weathered by years of neglect. He stood beneath the faded emblem of the anvil, wrench, and rising sun, thinking about everything they had uncovered since buying the building with their last $100. The workshop had already given them shelter. Now it offered something even greater. Ethan looked through the open doorway at the repaired workbenches and the tools slowly returning to life. An idea began to take shape, one that felt less like a business and more like a promise. The workshop looked different only a few weeks after the town meeting. The roof had been patched well enough to keep out the rain. The broken windows had been replaced with simple panes of glass, and the floor had been cleared of the debris that had hidden its history for so many years. The old wooden sign still carried the familiar emblem of the anvil, the crossed wrench, and the rising sun, but now it had been cleaned instead of forgotten. Ethan stood beneath it with a paintbrush in his hand, while Noah tightened the final bolts on a repaired workbench. Neither brother had much money left, so nearly everything inside the workshop had been rebuilt using salvaged lumber, donated tools, and spare parts gathered from Frank Dalton's scrapyard. Frank refused payment for most of it. "Consider it something my father would have wanted," he said with a quiet smile. Helen Brooks visited almost every afternoon, usually carrying sandwiches or fresh bread. Sometimes she simply sat near the doorway, watching life slowly return to the building she had once believed would disappear forever. One Saturday morning, a teenage boy stopped outside the workshop, holding a broken bicycle chain. He hesitated before stepping inside. "Can you show me how to fix this?" he asked. Ethan looked at the workbench, then at Noah. Neither needed to say a word. Noah handed the boy a pair of gloves while Ethan placed the damaged chain on the table. Instead of repairing it himself, he explained each step, allowing the teenager to do the work with careful guidance. When the bicycle rolled away an hour later, the smile on the boy's face reminded Ethan of something Samuel Turner had written in his journal. Helping someone lasts longer than fixing a machine. The following week, another young person arrived, then another. Some wanted to learn basic repairs, others simply needed a place where someone believed they could learn. Before long, the workshop echoed once again with the sound of tools, conversation, and quiet encouragement. It was different from the busy repair shop Helen remembered. Yet the spirit felt strangely familiar. Ethan carefully organized Samuel's journal, engineering drawings, letters, and photographs into protective display cases inside the office above the underground room. Visitors often paused to read the stories preserved there. Many left surprised that such an important part of the town's history had nearly been forgotten. The underground vault remained exactly as Samuel had left it, no longer hidden by secrecy, but protected as part of the workshop's history. The stopped pocket watch rested inside a glass case beside the journal, reminding everyone that truth could wait patiently until someone cared enough to uncover it. One afternoon, Mayor Collins returned to the workshop. He looked around as several teenagers worked beside Ethan and Noah, learning how to rebuild an old engine. "You've done something remarkable here," he admitted. Ethan smiled politely. "We just finished what someone else started." The mayor nodded before quietly leaving the brothers to their work. As the seasons changed, the workshop gradually became known for more than repairs. Parents brought their children to learn practical skills. Retired mechanics volunteered their time. Farmers stopped by not only to fix equipment, but also to tell stories about Samuel Turner, stories that had almost disappeared forever. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Ethan and Noah stood outside beneath the restored sign. The setting sun cast long shadows across the freshly repaired building. Noah smiled. "Hard to believe we bought this place with our last $100. Ethan laughed softly. "Everyone thought we'd wasted it." Noah looked toward the workshop windows, glowing warmly in the evening light.
Maybe we did buy a treasure after all. Ethan slowly shook his head. Not the kind people expected.
He glanced toward the underground room where Samuel's journal rested safely, then back at the voices of young apprentices still laughing inside the shop. The greatest thing hidden beneath the ruined workshop had never been money.
It had been the example of one ordinary man who believed helping others mattered more than being remembered. Because of that choice, two homeless brothers had found more than a place to live. They had found a purpose worth carrying forward. Above the entrance, a newly restored wooden plaque now stood beneath the original emblem. Its simple inscription read, Samuel Turner Workshop. Restoring machines, restoring futures. Ethan looked at the sign one final time before switching off the lights. The workshop doors closed for the night, but the legacy waiting inside would never again be forgotten.